As I've noted several times, Israel's modus operandi goes a bit like this. Commit a terrible atrocity that, unlike most atrocities committed by Israel in Gaza, receives significant media attention. Then deploy denial, deceit, deflection, muddy the waters, try to make the public think it's all a matter of he says, she says, wait for attention to move elsewhere, so it just becomes another murky incident in the fog of war. Who really knows what happens? Maybe we never will. That kind of thing. Now, the Israeli state exploits the fact that we rely on unbelievably courageous Palestinian journalists who've suffered the biggest massacre of journalists ever recorded in any conflict ever, whose work is not treated with the due respect by the Western media that they deserve. They exploit the fact, the Israeli state, that they've refused entry to foreign journalists and independent observers who can see for themselves the hideous war crimes being committed by Israel on a daily basis. That with Gaza being thoroughly destroyed, much of it is hard to access in any case for surviving journalists who are in a constant battle for the survival of both themselves and their own families, not least because of starvation. As for aid workers also, who bear witness, they've suffered the biggest slaughter of their profession in such a short space of time ever recorded. Now, the Israeli state also benefits from the fact, of course, above all else, that Western media coverage is decisively biased in its favour. All of this has allowed the Israeli state to get away with murder on a mass scale, slaughtering tens of thousands of Palestinians, including those buried under the rubble whose deaths are not included in the official statistics. Mostly, overall, women and children. Yeah, children. The mass butchery of kids has been one of the most sadistic facets of this hideous genocidal onslaught. And one striking example, just one example, but a horrific one which resonated with people, was that of 5-year-old Hind Rajab and her family. Not only were they all slaughtered by the Israeli military, but so too were 2 paramedics who were sent to rescue little Hind as she spent her last terrified moments, the last terrified hours of her life, in a car crammed with the dead bodies of her relatives, telling a responder how she was scared of the dark, begging to be rescued. This one atrocity alone, if it had been committed by a state hostile to the West, would have been front page news, the top of the bulletins. Frankly, it's the sort of atrocity which would be used to justify a military intervention against such a hostile state. If this atrocity had been committed on the 7th of October by Hamas or indeed other such armed groups, with Israeli kids and their relatives being butchered in the exact same way and the ambulance sent also being blown apart with 2 paramedics murdered, that would have become known as one of the most noted atrocities committed that day, with wall-to-wall coverage about how that showed the utter depravity and barbarism of Hamas, and it would have been used accordingly to justify the all-out onslaught against Gaza. You know it's true what I'm saying here, don't you? You know it's true. This one case study, and bear in mind when you include those buried under the rubble, the credible estimates are of around 20,000 Palestinian kids who suffered violent deaths at the hands of the Israeli state. This one case study is indicative of the absolutely unashamed, loud and proud racism which defines coverage of this overall obscenity, in which there has been no pretense that Palestinian life has equal worth to that of an Israeli life, or frankly, even the tiniest fraction of worth. Now, the Israeli authorities played their usual game here, as I say. In the case of the massacre of Hind, her family, and the paramedics who were sent to rescue her, they tried to suggest it could not have been them because their forces were not in the area. This claim should always have been treated with total contempt from the very outset, but it wasn't, allowing the Western media not to pin this decisively on the Israeli state as an atrocity which they unequivocally clearly committed, leaving it pigeonholed completely absurdly as yet another horrible but murky incident in which we simply can't clearly say who did what. Now, the Washington Post have done a detailed investigation which has destroyed Israeli claims. Now, some of you might go, hold on a minute there, Owen. The Washington Post? Isn't that an example of the Western media you keep savaging over Gaza? There's no question there has been hugely commendable, crucial journalism published in the Western media on the bloodbath of Gaza. No questions whatsoever. And I've referred several times to examples. In fact, the Washington Post did another really important study, which I also referred to, which tore to pieces Israeli lies about the first all-out onslaught against Al-Shifa Hospital last November, which was, until its destruction, of course, the biggest hospital in Gaza. The problem is, you get a few of these brilliant pieces of investigative journalism looking at a tiny proportion of the actual atrocities committed by the Israeli state, long after the actual atrocity has happened and overwhelmingly attention has moved on from that particular atrocity. Now, some might say, completely legitimately, well, look, investigative journalism takes time, it takes resources. And as noted, foreign journalists have been barred from entering Gaza, which makes it all the more difficult to establish the facts on the ground. I accept all of this. The problem is none of this compensates for the overall framing of Western coverage, whether that be the failure to frame coverage around the numerous genocidal statements of Israeli leaders and officials and generals and soldiers from the beginning, which all clearly demonstrate the intent behind the onslaught against Gaza. And the case studies such as this do not then feed into that overall coverage of definitively concluding that A, Israel is committing and has committed hideous war crimes on an industrial scale, and that defines the onslaught against Gaza, and B, that the Israeli state routinely and obsessively lies about its atrocities, and therefore Western media outlets should treat Israeli claims accordingly, as they would very correctly about similar such claims from official Russian sources. So we end up with the overall coverage being, well, let's debate whether Israel's so-called military response is proportionate or not, or how disproportionate is it, rather than being a case of, well, clearly the Israeli state has made its genocidal intent very, very clear, and we can see based on the utter ruinous destruction it has unleashed, as well as an entirely manufactured famine, that it has made good on its genocidal promises, and that Israeli denials are simply not credible whatsoever. We shouldn't have to cling on to these pieces of investigative journalism as life rafts, full of gratitude about war crimes being exposed, because they're not being used to frame overall coverage. And frankly, what proportion of people are even going to be aware of these very commendable pieces weeks after the atrocity in question happened? Now, as I keep saying, overall, Gaza, the Israeli onslaught against Gaza, is the greatest journalistic scandal of our time. Now, let's look at this Washington Post piece with that context in mind. Now, it details what happened that horrific day. 5-year-old Hind Rajab and her family and the paramedics, so altogether 10 civilians, were killed on the 29th of January. They were fleeing, the family, their neighbourhood in western Gaza City after 9:30 a.m. or so that morning. The IDF issued a call in Arabic on Twitter asking civilians in that area to evacuate. In other words, forcible displacement with a threat of violence. Now, Hind's uncle and aunt packed Hind and her 4 cousins into the car with the plan of driving north out of the zone covered by the evacuation order to the family home in northern Gaza City. They did not get far. By 1 p.m, Hind's 15-year-old cousin, Layan, called another uncle to say that they were surrounded and that the Israeli army had opened fire on their car and that everyone in the vehicle except for Layan and Hind were dead. Now, Layan then rang the Palestine Red Crescent and said, "They are firing at us. The tank is next to us." The tank, very important that. You then hear rapid gunfire and Layan screaming. That's the moment she was also killed. Now, the acoustics expert hired by the Washington Post say there were 62 gunshots in 6 seconds, that it was faster than an automated AK patterned rifle of the sort used by Hamas fighters, and the rate was more akin to weapons commonly issued to Israeli forces. A satellite image around an hour later, the Washington Post notes, found at least 4 Israeli armoured vehicles around 300 metres away from the car, with more than a dozen other Israeli armoured vehicles visible within a quarter mile of the car. Now, experts who looked at the images found the turret-like structures consistent with the appearance of Israeli armoured vehicles, and the gunshots heard are consistent with the machine guns used by those said Israeli vehicles, military vehicles. So then what happened? Little Hind, rang the Palestine Red Crescent and described the tanks moving closer to the car. The operator who liaised between the Palestinian Authorities Health Ministry in Ramallah, the West Bank, and Kogat, the IDF arm, which covers the occupied Palestinian territories, and said that this operator, that permission for an ambulance to get to Hind was given in the form of a route map from Kogat, so the IDF authorities. To quote from the article, the map reviewed by the Post appears to have been made in Google Maps and has a clear blue line instructing the ambulance drivers to follow an indirect route that avoided much of the evacuation area. The ambulance was then dispatched, and you can hear the paramedics liaising with the operators, discussing then a green laser hovering just in front of them before one of them says, "Oh, there," and there's an explosion. Now, the article says the green laser, known as a dazzler, would normally suggest that the ambulance was identified but not necessarily targeted by a ground unit operating ahead of the armed vehicles, according to Avihay Stoller, a researcher with Breaking the Silence, an advocacy group composed of Israeli army veterans who oppose the occupation, and that has compiled testimonies from former soldiers. Now, on the call with Hind, you hear a bang around the time the ambulance was blown up. By this point, Hind was falling silent for long periods. The team tried to keep her talking, but she kept saying, "Come get me quickly." She said she was scared of the dark. But then soon after, they lost contact with 5-year-old Hind. 12 days later, the car was found, the bodies of all of them in that family car, thoroughly decomposed. And as the article notes, a page from what looks like a colouring book was crumpled where their feet would have rested. The ambulance nearby was a burnt-out shell with almost nothing remaining of the paramedics' bodies. A fragment of a US-made weapon which can be fired by the relevant tank was visible, though they couldn't conclude, the experts, if it was directly connected to the ambulance strike. Meanwhile, the article notes, based on munitions experts, that common rocket launchers used by Hamas wouldn't create the observed damage. It concludes by saying none of the 6 munitions experts interviewed by the Post could say definitively what munition caused the damage or killed the paramedics based on the ambulance alone because of the time elapsed and the complexity of urban combat. They agreed, however, that the damage to the ambulance was consistent with the potential use of a round fired from Israeli tanks that matched the vehicles captured in satellite imagery in the area that day. Now, the IDF had said it had conducted earlier a preliminary investigation and that its forces were not present near the vehicle or within the firing range of the family car. That was a lie. They were lying. A straightforward lie. Again. Now, it's obvious they were all killed by the Israeli state. Because I saw people, some apologists for this heinous crime, by which I mean Israel's onslaught against Gaza, saying, well, it's not definite, it's not conclusive. Well, yeah, obviously, we don't have journalists on the ground. We can't observe exactly what happened. The car and the ambulance couldn't be reached for 12 days. But you can see there was absolutely no chance, clearly, based on all of that evidence, that it could have been anything other than those Israeli vehicles who the Israeli state lied and claimed weren't even there. It's just, at the end of the day, you just have to just look at what all the evidence overwhelmingly points to. And that's that they were clearly killed by the Israeli state and that the Israeli state lied about the circumstances. Again. Indeed, you could hear, and this is just, having to go through this as though there's some sort of doubt about what actually happened. You could hear the girls who were killed talking about tanks firing on them. Now, Hamas and other armed Palestinian groups obviously don't have tanks. That really should have been open and short evidence from the get-go. I mean, what would be suggested here? That 5-year-old Hind and her 15-year-old cousin were lying as they sat there with their murdered relatives, terrified, being fired upon before they too were killed. For what reason? Do you really think, 5-year-old Hind was just there saying there was a tank when there wasn't a tank firing on them? I mean, it's just not credible, is it? So, yes, you can't say, well, here's the munition that killed them and therefore, that shows who did it or what. We know the tanks were there. We know they said they were being fired on by tanks. And we know from what the experts on munitions say that the rate of the bullets being fired was consistent with Israeli machine gun fire from those relevant tanks, rather than, say, Hamas guns. And indeed, in terms of the ambulance itself, though it wasn't sure, people couldn't say, well, that green laser, who did that or not. But the evidence shows very clearly that an ambulance could not credibly have been blown apart with such catastrophic damage by a rocket launched by the sorts of weapons used by Hamas or other armed groups. Now, the Israeli state, the reason the Israeli state, this is what's so important, gets away with atrocities like this, some of the worst atrocities of the 21st century, keep bearing that in mind, is because the repeated failure of the Western media to hold them to account and to frame their coverage around the reality of what the Israeli state is actually doing. So we end up with detailed, commendable work here, which clearly just shows all the evidence points in one direction and one direction only, that the Israeli state murdered that family and the ambulance crew. But we only get that with these cause célèbres. Because in this case, we have the audio of a terrified 5-year-old girl talking to a responder, and that gives the story a prominence that other atrocities do not get. The vast majority don't get. We don't get detailed work about each of the, 20,000 or so potentially kids who have been violently slaughtered at the hands of the Israeli state. So all of the violent butchering of all those kids, their deaths are anonymous, lost in the entirely manufactured so-called fog of war. So yeah, this investigative journalism is important. I'm sharing it with you because we can't let the Israeli state keep committing atrocities and just wait for tension to move on until the truth definitively comes out. It's just not, to say it's nowhere near good enough is itself an understatement. We need this evidence to frame the actual overall narrative, the story of what Israel is doing to the Palestinian people of Gaza and beyond, because otherwise this isn't even scratching the surface. But we'll continue, in any case, using this platform as best as possible to raise attention to the atrocities being committed, the lies, and the catastrophic failure of Western journalism when discussing this crime. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments. Always read through your comments. Do share the video, get the word out. Help us take on the pro-war media, patreon.com/owners84. Listen to the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.